Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography, and today I'm talking about the 2011 action thriller Seeking Justice. In Seeking Justice, Nicolas Cage plays a teacher whose wife is sexually assaulted. At the hospital, Cage is approached by a mysterious man that represents an organization that quote-unquote deals with people, and he offers to deal with the rapist that abused Cage's wife under the agreement that Cage helps out the organization on a future date. The rapist gets taken care of and all seems fine, but 6 months later, Nick Cage gets a call that it's time to repay the favor. So Seeking Justice, also known as Justice, and the movie was almost called The Hungry Rabbit Jumps, which sounds like a random string of words, but The Hungry Rabbit Jumps is actually the code that the vigilante organization uses in this movie. And the phrase The Hungry Rabbit Jumps comes up a lot in the film, to the point where if you took a shot every time it was said, you'd be dead by the time the end credits rolled.
The Hungry Rabbit Jumps.
Hungry Rabbit Jumps.
The Hungry Rabbit Jumps.
Hungry Rabbit Jumps, eh?
The Hungry Rabbit Jumps.
That's right.
What does it mean?
I don't know, Nick Cage, you're the expert on bunnies round here. I actually think that The Hungry Rabbit Jumps would have made for a much more evocative and interesting title than Seeking Justice. Because the title Seeking Justice is boring, generic, and forgettable. But considering how mediocre this movie is, that title fits pretty perfectly, actually. But honestly, I quite like the premise of this movie. A shadowy vigilante organization that started off with good intentions but slowly corrupted into something more malicious is a cool concept. And the whole pay-it-forward approach to vengeance is something out of like a Twilight Zone-esque morality play. And it's also a bit like Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, but with a few extra steps. And I think the concept could have been used as a springboard for a moral conundrum story with a critique of the American judicial system. But I was also fully on board for a movie about Nick Cage having to do increasingly difficult tasks with all sorts of ethical dilemmas attached to them. And there's a little bit of that in the movie. It starts off very lightly and bizarrely, where like to sanction the murder of the guy who raped his wife, Guy Pearce tells Nick Cage that he has to buy 2 chocolate bars at the vending machine in the cafeteria to signal that he's on board, which does seem pretty arbitrary, and I wonder how often that's led to a mix-up. Alright, let's get a couple of chocolate bars. Ah, you must be the guy who wants to murder a rapist. Hungry Rabbit Jumps, eh? No, I'm hungry for chocolate. Who the hell are you? And then 6 months after that, Nick Cage gets told to buy some gum and then go through the back exit of a shop where Guy Pearce tells him to mail a letter to Santa, but the envelope actually contains a picture of the guy, so Nick Cage has to go to the zoo, and he's told that if he sees the guy there, he has to make a phone call. It's very lame, convoluted stuff. And by the way, if I had a nickel for every generic thriller I've reviewed where Nicolas Cage encounters an elephant, I'd have 2 nickels. And the culmination of all that is kind of a good scene where Nick Cage is told that he has to kill a sex offender, and he tries to talk to him, but they end up fighting on this tight walkway above the motorway. It actually was one of the few parts of the film I found kinda tense. But that's about the extent of Nicolas Cage doing tasks in this movie. What I thought was gonna happen was that after Nicolas Cage dealt with the guy that he thought was a sex offender, the Hungry Rabbits would then blackmail Nick Cage into doing even crazier stuff, like assassinating a corrupt politician. Or something like that, and then the missions would keep escalating. You know, something a bit like the movie 13 Sins, if you've seen that film, where a guy does all these crazy challenges for money and the stakes keep getting higher and higher. Or if we're talking about movies where the protagonist is given various challenges by a bad guy called Simon, then Die Hard 3 should be the gold standard. But no, in Seeking Justice, that gimmick gets dropped halfway through, and it just kind of becomes a dull string of Nicolas Cage running around nervously with boring investigation sequences tossed in. And that's where I really began to lose interest. And it's not just that, this whole movie reeks of missed opportunity. For example, I wanted to learn more about the vigilante organization. We only ever get to see one division of it, and we learn that there's higher-ups, but we don't really get to see any of that. I wanted the movie to go down the hungry rabbit hole. You know, show us the founder. Show us the head honcho with the hungry hairs. There was also one part where it seemed like Nick Cage had the upper hand over Guy Pearce, and I thought, okay, this could be fun. Now he's gonna get him to do tasks. And he does. He gets Guy Pearce to urinate in the toilet and tells him to buy a hot dog. And that's it. That's all he gets him to do. How about instruct him to do something involving a monster truck? Because, by the way, the scene takes place at a monster truck rally, but the movie does nothing with it. And instead our final climax takes place in an abandoned shopping center, which I guess was less expensive for the filmmakers, but also far less thrilling for the audience. Another bit that I thought was going to be cool is when Nick Cage goes to the wake for the guy that he was told was a sex offender who's actually a reporter. And Cage is there to find out more information about the organization, so he starts buying drinks for the friends of the deceased in this Irish pub. And what I thought was going to happen was that somebody was going to say to Nicolas Cage something like, "So, how did you know Alan?" And Nick Cage would be like, "Oh, me and Alan were old drinking buddies. Matter of fact, we knocked a few whiskeys back a couple of weeks ago." "Oh, that's funny, because Alan's been sober for 15 years. Come to think about it, the guy who's suspected of killing him looks just like you. Get him, boys!" And then it becomes this bar brawl with the whole Irish pub full of drunk, angry people trying to beat the shit out of Cage, and he has to escape. But what actually happens is they tell him that the journalist had a bunch of research about the vigilante organization hidden somewhere before he died. And then they say that Cage is probably a cop and they don't want to speak to him. Okay, so why did you just tell Nick Cage that information then? And then the bartender makes a call and a couple of hungry rabbits come in and Nick Cage runs away. Now, wasn't my version more exciting? And there's also this part where January Jones asks Nick Cage to finally explain what's going on. And then it cuts to something else and then it cuts back and she's like, "That's a pretty crazy story, huh? So, can we call the cops?" Come on, don't cut around it. I wanted to see Nicolas Cage try to explain to his wife all the crazy shit that's been going on. "Well, first I bought 2 candy bars to kill the guy who raped you, and then I went to the zoo to find a pedophile who threw himself into the motorway. You know, nothing out of the ordinary." I get that that's the kind of thing that you trim out of a screenplay to keep the pace going, but there's a few other parts that feel like they were severely edited down for the age certificate. Like the scene where January Jones is sexually assaulted is this very brief, shaky, quick cutscene interspersed with Cage's chess game. Now, I'm not by any means saying that I want to see some Gaspar Noé irreversible type shit, but I do kind of think that by downplaying and undercutting the brutal event so heavily in the film, it lessens the impact a bit on the viewer. There's also this part where a hungry rabbit gets hit by a car and his body gets dragged along the concrete, but we barely see anything. Come on, the guy should be a bloody mess. I found out that before this movie got produced, the original script of the film was featured on the blacklist list of most liked unproduced scripts of 2009. But basing my judgment solely on the version of the script that's in this movie, I don't think it's worthy of any kudos. There's a lot of foreshadowing and double meanings near the start that I think the screenwriter thought was clever, but it's so clunky and obvious. Like early on we see Cage giving a lecture about how we should express anger through words instead of violence. And when Nick Cage and Harold Perrineau are playing chess, Perrineau tells him that he plays too safe, and that he needs to take chances and not play to lose. And there's this part where Cage and January Jones are playing pool and Nick Cage says,
Go again, it'll give me a chance to even the score.
"Do you see what they're doing there?" Also, this movie might have the biggest damn squib of a who gives a shit ending I've ever seen. I think that the very last moment in this movie is meant to be a big shocking reveal, where Nick Cage finds out that a reporter character that he met earlier at the funeral scene is actually a hungry rabbit, and then we smash cut to the end credits. I don't know why the screenwriter of this movie thought that letting us know that this random reporter guy that we met in one scene like half an hour ago was part of the organization would have any impact on the audience. Because at that point in the movie, we'd met so many characters that were members of the organization, so I assumed that pretty much every character in this movie's universe was a hungry rabbit of some sort. It would have been a more shocking ending if at the end the guy said, "Hey, by the way, I'm not part of the hungry rabbits thing." Then I would have been like, holy shit, I didn't expect that. What a twist. Okay, so let's talk about the cast and characters, and let's start with lead justice seeker Nicolas Cage. Nick Cage's performance is decent here. He seems a little bit miscast, but I might be saying that because I would have preferred to see him in the Guy Pearce role. But Nick Cage does play this character's escalation of agitation quite well at times, and he does a good job of looking on edge. I did think that it was kind of weird that this middle-aged English teacher was so agile. I mean, the guy's able to scale a bridge with relative ease. I also found it kind of funny when his English teacher knowledge actually came in handy during the scene where he infiltrates a newspaper company and somebody asks him, "In a hyphenated compound situation, do you capitalize the second word?" And of course Nicolas Cage knows that if it's a participle modifier in the first word, then you gotta keep it lowercase. That moment to me just makes me think of the screenwriter of this movie going, how can we make the protagonist of this movie's English degree be important to the story? I know, let's have somebody ask him a grammar question. But my favorite moments involving his character were in the first 5 minutes of the movie where we see him having a good time at the nightclub. I think they wanted to kick off the movie with a bit of levity because of the dark subject matter in the rest of the film. But it is really fun to see Nick Cage briefly let his hair down.
Ow! No, it's not. Ow! It's... Ow!
I also enjoyed seeing Nick Cage dancing around with a mask on and throwing beads around.
Oh, not the bees! Not the bees!
No, I said beads, not bees. And he's rocking the beads and the mask because this movie is set in New Orleans.
Come on, we love New Orleans. Who dat?
And to be honest, I've got nothing else to say about New Orleans. I just wanted to bring up New Orleans to redeem myself after someone on my Bad Lieutenant comment section called me out for pronouncing it New Orleans. Guy Pearce plays the antagonist, and before I saw this movie I thought, okay, Guy Pearce with a shaved head playing an out-of-control leader of a vigilante organization. Even if this movie sucks, at least he's gonna be great, right? And having seen the movie, I don't think Guy Pearce is bad in the role, but I do think he underplays the role a bit too much, and he's also not really given enough screen time. I did kinda like the part where he gate crashes January Jones and Nick Cage's dinner, and he does get to have a big villainous monologue at the end where he starts chewing up the scenery a bit, and that whole speech is riddled with cliches, but at least he's given something to latch onto, which is more than I can say about most of the other recognizable actors in the movie. Jennifer Carpenter and Harold Perrineau have fairly forgettable parts. There is a revelation about Harold Perrineau's character in the last act, but at that point I was too disengaged to care. Xander Berkeley, who's usually reliable in the movie, struggles to retain any dignity here. And finally we have January Jones, who does the best with what she has. But I think I've said before that I hate it when a female character just feels like a plot device. And unfortunately, that's kinda how the writing of her character felt here. I did kinda wonder how Betty Draper would have handled the events of this movie though. So overall, this movie is not great. You know, despite the fact that this movie had a limited theatrical run, it does feel like we firmly entered that straight-to-video era of Nicolas Cage's filmography. I think this might be the first movie I've covered on this channel where I can't think of a possible reason as to why Nicolas Cage would have accepted this role other than the paycheck. I mean, a movie like G-Force was way worse, but at least there Nicolas Cage got to play a mole with a funny voice. But outside of a decent initial premise, Seeking Justice really doesn't have much to it. And that potentially interesting initial concept is completely squandered, as well as the talent of most of the cast. And it also felt like every 5 minutes I was yelling at the screen, why didn't you do this instead of that? It would have been better. I will say that it's not overtly awful, and it's fairly competently made. And if you happen to stick it on Netflix as your late night thriller, then your night won't be ruined. But there's also a lot of better ways that you can spend your time. I don't recommend it. It is interesting though, because I assume my Nicolas Cage journey is going to get harder from here on out. So for all I know, after watching some of the other Nicolas Cage straight-to-video garbage movies, I might end up reminiscing like, remember that movie where Nicolas Cage dramatically bought a chocolate bar and forced Guy Pearce to go for a piss? Those were the good old days, huh? So the next movie that Nicolas Cage was in was Trespass. So until then, thanks for watching.